Rome, the Eternal City. Thousands, if not millions, of people visit this city every year, and there is one place that they will not skip: the Sistine Chapel. First thing they do once they enter? Lift up their gaze towards the ceiling and let themselves be absorbed in Michelangelo's extraordinary frescoes. But the chapel did not always look like this. It all began with Pope Sixtus IV. In a time where the church has to endure a lot of troubles, he wants to restore the old glory. The church is powerful. The chapel is part of a larger program consisting of the construction of roads, bridges, and many other things. He does not construct a new building. Instead, he uses an already existing space that is called the Cappella Palatina. He left the outside for what it was and worked only on the inside. What exactly did he do when he had the building redecorated? An old print shows us what the chapel must have looked like when Michelangelo later found it in 1506. Archival documents tell us that it must have looked spectacular. The Pope had Italy's most famous painters, who were at that time based in Florence, come to Rome and decorate the walls, depicting the story of Jesus Christ on the right side and the story of Moses on the left side. The wooden ceiling was removed and replaced with a vaulted ceiling, decorated with golden stars. By the time that Julius II came into power, a large crack had appeared in the vault. Apparently, the crack was so bad that Julius II was advised to fix and redecorate the entire ceiling by one of Michelangelo's absolute rivals, the architect Bramante. It was probably for this reason that in 1506, Pope Julius II asked Michelangelo to redecorate the Sistine ceiling. However, Michelangelo refused. He was already working on Julius II's mausoleum, and most importantly, he did not want to paint. He persuaded the Pope to get Michelangelo to paint the vaulting of the Sistine Chapel. In this way, he and his other rivals hoped to confound him, for by taking him from sculpture, in which he was perfect, and putting him to coloring in fresco, in which he had no experience, they thought he would produce less admirable work than Raphael, and even if he succeeded, he would become embroiled with the Pope, from whom they wished to separate him. Thus, when Michelangelo returned to Rome, the Pope was disposed not to have the tomb finished for the time being and asked him to paint the vaulting of the chapel. Michelangelo was only in his 30s and he already got a commission like this. Now, if you think painting with little experience is a challenge, imagine painting in fresco. Working fast, in little bits at a time, it was a technique you really had to learn and experience. But he was faced with another challenge, that is, working at an incredible height while the chapel was still in use. What he came up with was a convex scaffolding that would follow the shape of the vault. In the 80s and 90s, restorers reconstructed the scaffolds that Michelangelo had made when he started painting the chapel. This way, they were also able to experience the extreme physical discomfort that he had found himself in for 4 years. In a letter to one of his friends, Michelangelo wrote a sonnet about how he had to lean backwards in order to paint over his head. This certainly took its toll on his body, so much that he was still suffering from neck problems and other conditions months after he had finished painting. On the bottom right side of the paper, he made a little drawing of himself painting God in the Sistine Chapel, illustrating the poem and his situation. It is also visible in the image of God in the act of creation, which reflects Michelangelo himself in the act of creating the ceiling. The ceiling program is centered around scenes from the Old Testament. Michelangelo painted 9 stories from the book of Genesis, beginning with the separation of light and darkness, followed by the creation of the sun, moon, and earth, the separation of land and water, the creation of Adam, the creation of Eve, the temptation and expulsion, the sacrifice of Noah, the great flood, and lastly, the drunkenness of Noah. Michelangelo began painting in 1508. He started out by painting the fresco of Noah, but once he had completed the scene and removed all the scaffolds, he realized that the figures were too small. He decided to adopt larger figures, as well as to make them more expressive in their movements. The frescoes were framed by painted architectural molding, and beneath it we see figures in the triangles as well as larger seated figures between them. The first group includes those who were believed to be part of Christ's human ancestry. Think of David, Josiah, and Jesse. The other figures consist of those who foretold the coming of Christ, prophets from the Old Testament, but also pagan sibyls. It is especially in these figures that we recognize a sculpturesque character. It has been said that when Michelangelo painted, he essentially painted sculpture on his surfaces. His figures indeed represent a perfect balance between strength and beauty. What Michelangelo created is considered today as one of the masterpieces of Western art. Although he was originally commissioned to paint only 12 figures, after the work was finished, there were more than 300. The complex design includes several sets of individual figures, both clothed and nude, in which Michelangelo fully demonstrated his skill in creating a huge variety of poses. The scenes and figures have provided an enormously influential pattern book of models for other artists ever since. It was unprecedented, and ever since, it has never been emulated. As Vasari writes in his elaborate account on the Sistine Chapel, this work has truly been a beacon to our art, illuminating all painting and the world which had remained in darkness for so many centuries. Indeed, painters no longer care about novelties, inventions, attitudes and draperies, methods of new expression, or striking subjects painted in different ways, because this work contains every perfection that can be given.